Infinite Session.
Infinite Session.
Infinite Session.
Infinite Session.
Infinite Session IPA. Damn, that's really nice.
I'm Chris, co-founder of Infinite Session. We're a non-alcoholic brewing company, so we make a range of non-alcoholic beers in the UK and in the US as well.
I know that you are distributed across the whole country, for example, in stores like Sainsbury's. How did you start it? What were the first few steps?
Well, yeah, that's a massive question. There's obviously tons of stuff.
Thank you, GoDaddy, for sponsoring this podcast. You as a listener get 40% off. The code is down below.
Chris, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining us. Do you mind kicking off the podcast by telling us a little bit about yourself and your business?
Yeah, hi Simon. I'm Chris, co-founder of Infinite Session. We're a non-alcoholic specialist sort of brewing company. So we make a range of non-alcoholic beers in the UK and now in the US as well. So we've been going for 3.5, nearly 4 years now, and it's myself and my brother that run the company. We started really from just like having a real passion for beer itself and loving the flavour and experience of drinking beer, particularly in the sort of local breweries in our neighbourhood in East London. Growing up through our 20s, trying loads of new different beers and really getting into craft beer, but also realizing that it wasn't the best idea to be drinking alcohol every night. So we started drinking non-alcoholic beers that were out there about 4 or 5 years ago. Basically realized that we thought we could create something a bit better that was a bit more flavorful and sort of had more depth and character to it. And from a branding point of view, didn't kind of position itself around being some sort of compromised item and that kind of thing. So it's been great fun starting the business so far. We're available nationwide in Sainsbury's. We have done for sort of 3 years. Have done really well in there and sell online through our own D2C store, Amazon, Whole Foods Market. And as I touched on, we just launched in America last year as well. It's been great.
So I think a lot of people listening will be like, I'd love to start my own alcoholic or non-alcoholic product range. And that just sounds like a massive undertaking to build it out. And I know that you are, for example, distributed across the whole country in stores like Sainsbury's, and getting that sort of thing all set up from production, structure and distribution, and then of course actual sales is quite a task. And I'd like to get into that. And today as well, I'd also like to talk about, is it a good idea to work with family? So why don't we start off with talking about how you actually got it going, so people understand. I mean, did you have a job before you started this? Did you quit your job? Where did you get the funds? What was the first few steps that you took?
Yeah. So I've always been in food and drink. Before this, I'd had some other less successful, let's call it, ventures in food and drink. So the two ventures I'd had, one was a frozen yogurt and one was a sports drinks company. So the frozen yogurt I started while I was at university and managed to get that in Harrods and Sainsbury's, working with my best friend, Will. It was called Arctic Farm. So we produced tubs of frozen yogurt that we sold in those supermarkets. And then with the sports drink, that was called Overly. We sold that in Whole Foods, Harvey Nichols, lots of specialist sort of stores, sports facilities, Amazon, that kind of thing. And that was all about being a sort of a better for you version of a Lucozade Sport. So I'd had a lot of experience, I guess, with working with food and drink products on a startup level. Really, the sort of move to Infinite Session and alcohol-free beer came when my business partner had moved abroad with Overly, decided for personal reasons to sort of change his life somewhat, and so it sort of left me with a choice of whether I kept moving with Overly, which at that point was doing okay and had some really good opportunities, but equally needed a bit of external finance to take advantage of some of those opportunities and to really take it to the next level. Or I'd had this idea around beer. I think it just had a bit more personal connection for me. Likewise, my brother, who I was living with at the time and still do, had been really interested in the beer sort of concept, and so decided really to make that move. And yeah, so that was the kind of the background where I'd been involved in food and drink sort of startups before.
So, but previously, generally speaking, it always been your own business. So I know you started off in merchandising at Marks and Spencer's. Did that give you some grounding for this business, or do you feel like in a way you could have gone straight into starting your own business and that was perhaps not necessary?
I mean, to be fair, that was really a 6-month work placement while I was at university. I was 18, 19 while I was there. I was in a head office working environment, but equally, yeah, I wouldn't say that did too much for me. I mean, I think with it, you have to try and take what you can from each of these things. I also worked for Jordan Cereals for a year after university in a kind of product innovation team and brand marketing teams. And there's definitely quite a lot that I picked up from there. I mean, that's quite a while ago now. It's nearly 10 years since I was there, but certainly that one, I would say, more being in a kind of FMCG environment, I would have picked up more do's and don'ts. And you see sometimes with the bigger companies, and like I say, this is a while ago now, like how long it can take them to get a product to market, and there are good and bad things about those processes. Sometimes they're there for good reason, but equally, you can see the frustration sometimes of good product ideas that don't make it out in time because the internal bureaucracy and that kind of thing. So yeah, that was a really good experience.
They've got something to lose, I guess, right, as well. So they have to go a little slower. And but that's also you see their weakness.
Or sometimes they think they've got more to lose than they.
That's true.
Yeah,
that's true.
Than they actually do. I remember certain products being shelved because there were internal worries, for example, that it might eat into the sales of existing products, and then you just see competitors launch these better products, and it seems silly when it's something better that you've got behind the scenes. But anyway, yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean that's why brands like Apple, you always have to admire them because they have the iPod that's doing really well, but they bring out the iPhone that actually cannibalizes the iPod, because if you've got the iPhone, you don't need the iPod as much.
Definitely.
So you have to innovate that way, not do the kind of
taking those risks to innovate. And
exactly. Well, I guess just before, I want to just quickly go. Something you're talking about there is really interesting, I think, for the listeners, which is a lot of people ask us, should they go get experience or just start a business? My personal belief, because I left school at 15, is if you're passionate about something, you'll learn it, and if you're working it, then you can learn it by just doing. So just start. And you'll build it along the way and learn along the way. Sometimes when you go work in companies, you can learn their bad habits and learn their bad ways. But I think you're saying a mixture of the two. From it was good experience.
Yeah, I think if I was advising anyone in my position, in a similar position, I mean, or whatever, I think like you say, starting as soon as possible is the most important thing. And I think for a lot of people, that will be starting alongside working in another company if they can, because depending on what kind of business you are. Often, especially if you end up outsourcing, for example, a lot of things, as we outsource our production and the vast majority of the stuff within our business, you're so dependent on other people that actually in the early days, it's better to be, I think, to hold down an existing job and do that on the side, and then build it up to a point where it really demands all your attention. It's really, you can feel that this is really, going somewhere, because, when you're developing a new product, for example, often there are just times when, you may have the motivation to be working 16-hour days, but quite fundamentally, that isn't what is important. You're often waiting on other people to get back to you. And that process just takes time. It could be 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, whatever it is. And that's what obviously a lot of people do choose to do, and start something in their kind of kitchen table while they're holding a job and then transition over. And I think that often is the best way to do it. But like you say, in terms of habits and picking up bad habits and that kind of thing, I think, that's about not staying somewhere maybe too long if you think that it's not the right environment. But equally, probably it's quite helpful to see when things aren't done so well, if you can keep that distance.
I'm really keen to get into the conversation about working with family, but just before we go there, because I just want to finish up how you got this business going. I think it's interesting when you mentioned Overly and the whole feeling like the non-alcoholic beer idea was more purposeful to you. it felt more compelling to you. But I just wondered if you could describe. I mean, it must have been hard to close down an existing business and let that go.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we've worked on it for a significant amount of time. I think probably 4 years or so in total. And it's obviously a really big part of your life. I think, obviously, from my point of view, it made it an easier decision once my business partner had left and moved on to different things and completely sort of changed his life, really. So yeah, I think, like you say, the main draw was the fact that, you know, I was really passionate about beer, and I was really passionate about drinks and sports and everything around that before, but there was just more of a stronger sort of connection with this, and it just sort of ticked every box. You know, having been in the industry for a while before, I knew the importance of the fact that the category was really going to be moving quickly. It was quite obvious that this was really going to be a not only a trend, but a long-lasting one, that, you know, people would be making the sort of the move to better non-alcoholic sort of options over not just the next couple of years, but the next sort of 10, 20 years. So that made it an obvious sort of move from a kind of a you know, both a functional and a sort of emotional sort of side as well.
But again, for our listeners, I think it's a really valuable insight, because a lot of people today might be running a business they don't love because they've started it and spent 4 years building it. And I think your example, by focusing on something with purpose, I mean, it's absolutely incredible what you've done with your business. And I think sometimes accepting that, you know, it's not for you, and maybe letting it go and not seeing it as a sunken cost, seeing it as an experience for the next thing that you do that is exciting for you, is a really interesting journey that you went on.
If this podcast is inspiring you to start or grow a business, then I recommend you use Taylor Brands. They are our sponsor for this podcast, and they help you not only craft a brand, but design merchandise and so much more. In the last year, I've used this site for every single one of my businesses. I couldn't recommend them more. And we've even negotiated a 40% off discount code for you. Just use PEP, PEP, when using their website to make your booking. Now, let's get back to the podcast.
But then let's just quickly talk about, so you then decided to go full on with the alcohol-free craft beer. How did you start it? What were the first few steps?
I guess, again, from the experience, I knew that the two key things were, and it's quite obvious, but the beer and liquid itself, like the taste of how good the product tasted, particularly in alcohol-free, where, you know, historically stuff hasn't tasted good, and that being the sort of the main challenge. That was number one. And number two was getting the brand and the identity right. Those were going to be the kind of the cornerstones for our business. So that's what we really focused on early days. So a lot of my time early on was spent researching the beer and non-alcoholic sort of beer markets. That wasn't just going to breweries and tasting alcoholic beer, but it was reading a lot of research papers on the best non-alcoholic sort of methods. Tom and I went over to Munich, to the technical university there, which is probably the best brewing institution in the world, where they've got PhD students working on non-alcoholic beers and learning a lot from there. The German non-alcoholic beer market is quite a way in advance of the UK one, so that was extremely important. I'd had product development, experience from everything I'd done sort of before, both on the sort of bigger company side and from, our own stuff. So I was confident that we would be able to develop, something really good. Brewing is a lot more technical than sports drinks, definitely, I think, in some ways, and other sort of soft drinks or different sort of projects. So it was definitely a lot to sort of get stuck into from a technical and science perspective. So we've worked with Jen Merrick, who was the old head brewer at Beavertown, on a lot of our recipes. So it was kind of combining my, I guess, lack of the fact that I didn't have too much technical knowledge in the early days was a real help, because at that point, most brewers that we were speaking to contract brew our beer had never brewed a non-alcoholic beer. In fact, sort of everyone, and they didn't really believe it was possible without expensive machinery. And it was up to me to kind of translate the sort of ideas. And, we took some quite simple concepts from the actual beer itself from what we'd seen in our favorite beers from the likes of the German market and things, and brought them into developing a pale ale that we thought would sell well in London. So it was quite helpful actually that I didn't know that much, I think, at that point, but equally combine that with the expertise of someone like Jen.
Fascinating. And so the business was born. Now, I wanted to get into the family dynamics. I've personally had terrible experience working with my brothers. I've got 3 brothers. I've worked with 2 of them, and both ended horribly. But I wondered, how have you managed? What do you think's been the secret recipe to, not to your beer, because I wouldn't want to give that away, but the secret recipe to how you managed to make your partnership work as a family dynamic? Because that, for a lot of people, is both the dream and potentially the nightmare. So how do you view it?
Look, I think it's never going to be easy. We had a great relationship going into it, and we still luckily do have a great relationship, but there is going to be probably those sort of rocky moments. I think the fact that we also live together kind of maybe does compound that as well, and makes it an extra sort of challenge. But I think, first of all, I'm just really, really lucky that Tom is the way that he is, and we're so understanding, and just sort of the best guy to sort of work with from that perspective. So that is really helpful. And between us, we're not the sort of people that would like an argument, for example, not that we have many, but to be left sort of, overnight or anything like that. It's one of those things where emotions are always going to be high at certain points throughout this kind of journey. We're both very different sorts of characters, which is great for lots of aspects of the business, but naturally that can rub at certain sort of times. So yeah, I think it's really important to acknowledge, like, between yourselves as early as possible that problems will happen, so that when they do, you can kind of be like, well, remember when we said that this was going to happen? Well, it's happening now. It's just one of those things that we're going to get through, and we'll be out the other side. We're both, we're both maybe feeling frustrated at this moment in time, but I think acknowledging it as early as possible is sort of the best way, and knowing fundamentally that you're going to ride those things out because your family, and that you can sort of get through those sort of things. But yeah, I think fundamentally I'm just lucky that he's a very patient, understanding sort of person, because not everyone I understand has got that sort of people in their lives.
It's interesting. I think did you do a shareholders agreement? Did you have a lot of paperwork structure in place?
Yeah.
Yeah,
but I think that was more for our first, our investors, to be honest. When we first started, we didn't, but not until we got to that point. But I think there was just such a high level of trust overall that again, living together, everything else, it didn't really feel necessary.
It's a lovely story. A lot of people listening might think it sounds like a marriage. I mean, I've been married for 21 years. I actually married my business partner. Yeah. So,
wow.
But we started out as business partners, and she fell in love with me. What can I say? But the point I'm making here is that it is very much like a marriage, isn't it? I mean, the way you just described the whole process, communication comes across as key, honesty, being, transparent with each other, and accepting each other's weaknesses and strengths. I mean, I wonder if it's one of the things that I've noticed as a trend, so I always like to test if this is still true, that you do very different jobs. So you don't bother each other, and you give each other respect for that area. So I guess you and Tom do very different jobs.
Yeah. So Tom's a qualified chartered accountant. So I was quite lucky coming into this that he would be, and he very much takes over that sort of most of the day-to-day operational, a lot of the day-to-day operational side, legal things, stuff like that. Whereas I'm very much on the kind of, new product development, marketing, sales, branding, some of the operational, stuff as well. But it was quite clear early on how that would be separated. And like you say, I think letting each other sort of get on with those things is important. I think, there are compromises that you sort of have to make, I think, in order to keep the relationship right. I mean, we, can't come into an office or whatever with each other, or day to day treat each other like it's a sort of boiler room type of environment where we're going to just crank up the pressure to 100, where, you know, some maybe startup environments, and I'm not advocating that as a kind of a healthy thing anyway, but like, so, you know, some people would really be able to push each other to the limit day in, day out, working in an office. But when you're with your family member and especially if you're living with them as well, I mean, there's certainly, although that might be good every now and again, day in, day out, that's just not going to work. It's not, you know, if you're looking for something that's got any kind of sustainability to it and longevity, well, you know, really sort of pushing each other to the limit every single day when you're family and you know, have other relationships with each other, it's just, that's not going to work. Where, you know, potentially you could get away with it for a slightly longer period of time if you're, you know, more in a kind of detached or corporate or, you know, startup sort of office environment, if you like.
No, it's a very good point, actually. And as you're saying these things, all of the things that I did wrong in the partnerships with my brothers have all the traits of what you just described. I mean, definitely when my older brother, it was like working in the boiler room. He was very high pressure, always pushing, and it kind of ruined the journey a bit, you know. And you've got to pace it and see it as a fun process, not just two people pushing each other to the limit, and therefore pushing your teams to the limit. And so I can relate to that point very much so.
Yeah, I think, you know, I've been my previous business was with my best friend as well, so there's a sort of a brotherly element to that as well. And I think you do just have to learn when to give each other space, because, you know, it might be fine for a bit and they'll give you that slack, but eventually they'll probably end up resenting you if you sort of push that too far. And I think, yeah, the thing I'm probably most grateful for is that we've managed to, you know, we've sort of developed a way of working, I guess, where it's sort of just, we give each other a bit more of that space. Obviously, there's all the benefits of being able to be really honest with each other and sort of have that sort of closeness, but is equally knowing when not to sort of push. Yeah,
totally. I mean, again, just listening to your story about Overly, sounds like your partner wanted to stop and you accepted it. And that's just, you know, that's also part of it, isn't it? As partners, you have to go together, go in it together, and perhaps accept that it's come to the end together.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm really lucky with, and I was always really lucky with Will, that he was such a great person to work with, and you know, we're still, you know, best mates. So
that's nice to hear.
Really grateful for how that's gone, and it's, you know, there's no hard feelings or anything there sort of between us. It was just one that sort of naturally we just decided to, you know, it sort of, I guess, sort of run its course. Or from my perspective, I felt like I could have gone ahead with it still, but, you know, I'd had this idea with the beer, and I just felt it was it was really a case of weighing them up at that point.
Well, even having that choice is pretty amazing, because again, drawing on my own experiences, it was like, you know, do it with me or don't do it at all, sort of synopsis. So I kind of like the idea that you know, your partner gave you the choice. That's also decent, isn't it? It's not holding it over you. And so some really great insight and lesson there, and I appreciate you sharing your personal story as well. I mean, just to round, I could talk to you forever, Chris. Like, there's so much more I want to know about your business, so we'll have to have you back on. But I just want to close this first episode we have with you by just asking you a final question, which is, if you had to do it all again, what would you do differently?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a massive question. There's obviously tons of stuff. I think you can't second guess yourself too much. You just have to kind of go with the journey and learn as you go. I think I would take a few things a little bit slower. I think it's easy, obviously, you know, when you're developing a product and you've told your friends and your family, and you kind of started to get it out there, then it feels like the pressure is on a bit almost to kind of make that progress, whether it be getting the product to market or getting the first listing or and you know, when you're in that moment, everything feels so much longer than it actually is. And I think when you look back, you kind of, you know, as I do now, you probably think and realize you could take a few things a little bit more slower and make sure you get them right. And, you know, even for me, that not being my first product, you can still kind of get caught up in just wanting to get that out there and stuff. And look, you've got to balance it with, I personally do believe the best way of learning is sort of to have things in market and to not try and perfect too much, because ultimately your best way of learning is getting that product out there, getting feedback from consumers and that kind of thing. But where I wish I'd probably spent a bit more time was things like, with production and manufacturer relationships early on, like in our game where we don't own our own brewery, for example, like having relying on sort of other breweries that we work with to produce the product is extremely important, but it is really difficult, especially in the market at the moment. With COVID, I think breweries have found it really difficult to manage demand and with all the pressures on supplies and all that kind of thing, to know how much space they've got to work with third parties like ourselves. But I think definitely within our thing, it would have been probably early on just taking a bit more time to really find the best people to have those longer term relationships, because certainly we're really happy with the sort of the main brewery that we work with now, but it took us definitely a few years to get there, and it's a shame we sort of weren't able to get there a bit earlier, and that would have saved a bit of stress and everything else, I guess, early on.
Great insight, great tips. Thank you for sharing, and I appreciate it very much, Chris. We'll definitely have you back on. Again, thank you for being on the podcast.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Simon. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Pep Talk. We hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to follow the Purposeful Project on all our social media channels, where we're giving away even more free business secrets and entrepreneurial value. Again, we'd like to thank our sponsor GoDaddy for powering this podcast. From naming a business to buying a domain name to building your website for free, GoDaddy has you covered. For 40% off GoDaddy tools, click the link in the podcast note below and use the code GDXPepTalk. See you next time, entrepreneurs, and remember, you're not alone.